Hello everybody, welcome back. The second to last lecture. I can't believe we only have 2 more lectures to go, then we have to say goodbye to the samurai. Well, of course, not really, but today is it's really the beginning of the end for samurai political power. We're going to be looking at them in the just basically the samurai in Bakumatsu, Japan. What is this term, Bakumatsu? This, in Japanese, means the end of the Bakufu. Basically, the very, very final stages of Tokugawa rule, the 1850s to the 1860s, when the wheels really come off the bus. So, why did the wheels come off the bus? Well, we have been kind of circling around this issue for a couple of lectures now, and there's just so much to say. You can spend a whole class on the problems of the Tokugawa as they had appeared by the end, saying, when did these guys pass the point of no return? But really, by the 1850s and 1860s, events were taking their own course. The Bakufu, as we've seen, tried to initiate some military reforms, and it also allowed and even encouraged the domains to do likewise. So all of these semi-independent daimyo were encouraged to upgrade their armies, even have modern military warships. European steamboats, American steamboats found their way to Japan. The famous HMS Beagle, which had taken Darwin to the Galapagos, actually ended up as a warship in the Tokugawa Navy. So there was a great deal of learning from Westerners now in that sense, since commerce was allowed. Part of this commerce was commerce in weapons. And the Tokugawa, their own reforms in this area, as we have seen, were not altogether successful. They weren't a complete failure. New methods of fighting, as infantry, for example, those did stick. But the Bakufu never managed to succeed in their reforms in some of the ways that the independent daimyo did. Places like Choshu and Satsuma, which we'll talk about later, and which became the enemies of the Tokugawa, were much better at launching military reforms. We'll definitely come back to this point today. Financial problems and succession crises, and we've seen that in the last lecture. Great dependence on merchants, daimyo going into debt, passing on the burden to their peasants, trying to get more and more taxes out of the peasants tipping over into starvation in many cases, rioting, breaking into to the houses of the richer peasants, of government officials. The Bakufu actually, and not only them, but a lot of daimyo, especially samurai in the Kanto area, especially around Edo, where this crisis was more pronounced, they actually started to arm the richer peasants against the poorer peasants. There's some great studies being done now by David Howell about commoner militias in the late Edo period. There were all sorts of developments where it was just clear that financial problems were going to sink any government that did not successfully reform itself, be it the Tokugawa or the various domains. Famines and earthquakes. A famine was certainly not unknown during the Tokugawa period. I believe there were over 20 serious famines and something like 150 localized famines during this period. And from the 1830s on, there was a worsening agricultural crisis in in Japan, especially in the northeastern part, in Tohoku. Very great amount of suffering and responses by samurai authorities that were not that were not very successful at dealing with such crises. If you have a famine in a neighboring domain, oftentimes it would not be in your interest to go and help your neighbor because your own resources were also stretched very thin, and then maybe the Tokugawa would step in, maybe they would pay a third domain to sell some rice to the domain where there was a famine, but really the ability of the state to intervene in these matters was not great. The Tokugawa bureaucracy, for as much as it had expanded, was still a pre-modern pen and paper bureaucracy. Many villages were isolated, and there was a sense in which these kinds of crises were just following one upon another very quickly, and people were flabbergasted. And earthquakes certainly didn't help. There were major earthquakes during this time period as well that kind of both caused enormous material devastation, but also were seen as portents of violence and death. Speaking of violence and death, lots of political assassination, which we will talk about a lot today as well. But basically, radical young samurai had by now formed into bands and infested, especially Kyoto, but also Edo and some of the other cities, killing Tokugawa officials, killing off Fudai samurai officials, allies of the Tokugawa, people who, spoke nicely to the Tokugawa. It was a period of increasing violence and instability and foreign aggression. As we shall see today, there were two instances where foreign fleets had come in and burned two Japanese cities to the ground in response for violence against Westerners. Let us take, for example, the Namamugi incident, which led to the so-called Satsuma War of 1863. It wasn't really a war, but it was a military action. What happened was a party of British travelers outside of Edo, they were actually in the bounds of what is today Yokohama, met a procession by the father of the daimyo of Satsuma, a very high-ranking samurai, met this procession on a crowded street in a village called Namamugi, and the Europeans refused to dismount. The samurai took this as a grave affront. Richardson was killed. Two more people in his party were wounded, and this was a outrage as far as the Europeans were concerned, because the Satsuma forces had killed a European and weren't even pretending to be sorry. They were like, no, this guy was rude, and by the way, we have this law in the books called Kiriste Gomen, which we talked about last time, which basically said it's okay to kill people, to kill commoners who are rude to you. And this is how the Europeans were interpreted, and violence. Well, what the British did is they demanded compensation. The Satsuma government refused to compensate them, so a fleet made up of British ships and some other ships from allied nations basically sailed into the chief port, the capital, the castle town of Satsuma, Kagoshima, and basically leveled the city, captured the outlying military batteries, and this was seen as a huge, as a demonstration of European military power, but also a warning, a sign of things to come, that if these foreigners, the sentiment went among many of the more radical samurai, if these foreigners were not kicked out soon, they're just, we're going to see them burning town after town, and it'll be impossible to kick them out. So something has to be done. These foreigners have to go. The imperial court during the Bakumatsu period played a absolutely unique role. As we've seen, the claim for political authority of the shogunate and by extension of all samurai, really came from a certain kind of relationship with the imperial court, where the samurai would borrow the prestige of the imperial court, but would in effect control it. During the Bakumatsu period, as the Tokugawa were rocked by problem after problem, famines, these foreigners come, nobody knows quite what to do with them. There's peasant riots increasingly in the countryside, and it can be demonstrated that the number of peasant disturbances greatly increased. We have a situation where the Bakufu is weakened enough so that the imperial court can assert itself once again. Nobles from the court and eventually the emperor make contact with some radical samurai. Some nobles, for example, very famous Iwakura Tomomi, made these kinds of contacts and even themselves became active in the management of a quickly growing underground movement that was geared, the goal of which was to basically overthrow the Tokugawa. People were talking more and more in those terms. And what really gave coherence to these radicals were the actions of the imperial court. By 1863, Emperor Kome, a very interesting figure who seemed to vacillate between radically anti-Western and conciliatory positions towards the Tokugawa, in 1863 felt that it was in the interests of the imperial court to issue the so-called Order to Expel Barbarians. In 1863 this was, and the slogan for this type of attitude that the order embodied was revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Sonno Joi, right? Sonno Joi. Sonno, revere the emperor. Joi, expel the barbarians. Now, the imperial court had, if you remember, refused to allow the Tokugawa to sign the expanded commercial treaties with the Westerners in 1858. The Tokugawa had done so anyway. Then Ii Naosuke was assassinated in 1860, and though the Tokugawa were led by some pretty shrewd samurai capable of dealing with Westerners, Abe Masahiro, for example, in 1861 had managed to enlist British support to thwart a Russian attempt to take over the island of Tsushima. The Russians kind of built a base on that island and just refused to leave. And the Tokugawa knew that they couldn't kick them out, so they got the British to come in and tell the Russians, you have to leave Tsushima or there's going to be war. It took a great deal of skill to pull this off, and Ii's successors, once again, Abe Masahiro chief among them, but with some other people also playing prominent roles. These were able figures, but the authority of the Tokugawa had by that point been very well undercut. And this refusal of the imperial court to sanction the Tokugawa moves in 1858, well, basically you saw it reappear in 1863. What is this order to expel barbarians? Well, I forget what date was stipulated, but on a certain date, basically every samurai in Japan was supposed to rise up and throw out the foreigners. It's not, I mean, almost nobody paid attention to this. Almost nobody. That is to say, almost nobody followed the order. The government of Choshu did, because Choshu, this powerful domain at the very western end of the island of Honshu, that we've seen several times, whose retainers every year gathered to ask their lord whether it was time to overthrow the Tokugawa or not, that domain had been the government of that domain was now recently had come under the control of reformers, had come under the control of people who were very unwilling to basically see where matters led if the country continued to follow its current course, and thought, yeah, we really should throw these foreigners out. So they were reformers. They were also radicals in the sense that they were really anti-Western. So in 1863, Emperor Komei issues this order: Choshu troops fire on foreign ships, and a foreign flotilla comes and destroys their chief city, not their capital city, but their most important city, which was the port of Shimonoseki. Just completely destroyed all of the fortifications. And so the direct result of the order to expel barbarians was really not an expulsion of barbarians. Far from it. Most governments did not follow this order. Most daimyo did not follow this order. The Tokugawa were very amused by it. But and there were, Satsuma samurai were also very unhappy with some of the foreigners, and as we've seen, though, they were pretty much out of it because their own major port had been blasted into nothing as well. But really, you did not see a direct overthrow of the Tokugawa because of this, and the importance of this order lies not so much in what it actually achieved, but in this concept of sono joi, right? Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. In the importance of the order lies in basically giving form to this concept, which became a rallying point around which later the Tokugawa government was indeed overthrown.